For the past decade, the global narrative surrounding India has focused on two pillars: rapid GDP growth and its standing as the world's largest democracy. But the V-Dem Institute, which measures the health of global governance, recently reclassified India. It no longer qualifies as an electoral democracy, but rather an electoral autocracy. At the same time, the 2022 Environmental Performance Index, produced by Yale and Columbia Universities, ranked India at the absolute bottom. Out of 180 countries evaluated on sustainability, air quality, and climate mitigation, India placed 180th. And in the 2025 World Justice Project Rule of Law Index, the country's overall score continued a downward slide, dropping to 86th place globally. This causal model maps a chain reaction. When democratic erosion begins at the center, the fracture lines spread directly into environmental management and economic stability. Authoritarian consolidation degrades a state's capacity to govern, disabling the regulatory mechanisms intended to protect the environment and the economy. Dismantling democratic checks and balances strips a state of the structural capacity needed to manage complex environmental threats or mobilize its human capital. To understand the mechanics of this decay, we start with the baseline data from the 2025 World Justice Project. India experienced a 1.7% overall score decrease, driven by an expansion of authoritarian trends. We can see the specific drivers of this decline in the WJP's factor score rankings. First, the index measures effective limitations on the executive branch. Out of 143 countries, India ranks 62nd, indicating an erosion of accountability mechanisms. In parallel, India ranks 103rd in the fundamental rights category, highlighting a collapse in basic human protections. This happens because the executive branch bypasses the judiciary to achieve political goals. The WJP report explicitly notes that judiciaries are losing ground to executive overreach, and that both civil and criminal justice systems are operating under improper government influence. Without an independent judiciary, the state weaponizes the law against its critics. Under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, or UAPA, student activists and journalists are frequently arrested, and they are held for years without a trial. Simultaneously, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act is used to raid and financially strangle independent NGOs, effectively outlying the civil society groups that monitor government action. This lack of oversight allows the ruling party to advance a Hindu nationalist ideology that drives the organized targeting of marginalized demographics, specifically Muslim and Christian minorities. Human Rights Watch documented how this translates into physical displacement. In states run by the ruling party, authorities have conducted arbitrary home demolitions and expelled thousands of Bengali-speaking Muslims, bypassing due process entirely. When a government removes legal constraints and silences independent watchdogs, it destroys the critical early warning systems required to recognize and prevent larger state failures. A state operating without unconstrained civil watchdogs quickly loses its ability to execute long-term, data-driven policies. We see the result in the physical environment. The Yale and Columbia 2022 Environmental Performance Index evaluated 180 nations on 40 performance indicators. India finished last. The most lethal failure is in air quality. According to the EPI, poor air quality causes millions of premature deaths in India every year. The state is also failing to protect its ecology. India ranks 177th in the conservation of its national terrestrial protected areas. The lead authors of the EPI concluded that governance quality separates sustainable nations from failures. India's collapse in the WJP governance scores correlates directly with its inability to enforce environmental protections. We can map this failure onto the 2021 Glasgow Climate Pact. This graph contrasts. The government frequently points to its efforts to expand renewable energy, but the empirical data proves that current investments in decarbonization and clean energy are entirely insufficient to offset their overall emissions growth. When citizens attempt to point out environmental policy failures, the state relies on its governance loopholes. In 2025, climate activist Sonam Wangchuk was arrested under the National Security Act for leading a peaceful march regarding ecological protections. An unconstrained executive branch, hyper-focused on maintaining ideological control, becomes structurally blind. It loses the capacity to execute the complex, multi-decade strategies required to manage an environment. This same structural blindness extends to the economy. India holds a massive demographic advantage, one of the largest youth populations in the world. But it is currently trapped in what economists call the Great Indian Employment Paradox. The paradox is defined by a simple, broken correlation. Higher levels of education are currently resulting in higher rates of unemployment. A recent literature review published in the International Journal of Indian Psychology examined the human cost of this paradox. Looking at this data, we see the clinical fallout. As educated youth find themselves blocked from the workforce despite holding degrees, the lack of professional identity directly correlates with a widespread loss of self-esteem, chronic stress, and clinical depression. The data also reveals deep structural inequalities. These unemployment rates and the resulting psychological burdens disproportionately impact educated women living in urban centers. If we cross-reference this with the VDEM Institute's findings, we see that personal autonomy and individual rights for these exact marginalized groups are deteriorating at the same time. When a state fails to integrate its educated youth into the economy and simultaneously removes their democratic avenues for dissent, it transforms its greatest demographic asset into a volatile, disenfranchised liability. Zooming out to the complete causal model, the data from the WJP, the Yale EPI, and the psychological metrics form a cohesive picture. The data reveals a demonstrable structural degradation of state capacity across legal, environmental, and economic domains. Yet the international community largely ignores this data. Foreign actors, including the United States and the European Union, actively strengthen their trade agreements and security ties with New Delhi without enforcing human rights or environmental obligations. This is a deliberate geopolitical blind spot. Global powers are prioritizing short-term strategic partnerships and access to Indian markets over the long-term stability of the region. But the data provides a clear warning. Authoritarian consolidation inherently blinds a state to existential threats, breaking the mechanisms required to fix them. While geopolitical narratives often emphasize economic potential, objective metrics prove that India's current institutional trajectory is inherently unsustainable.